the impact on the continent by the removal of the people. So it would be interesting because we're here to have some of the conversations, especially because of warring. The second one, of course, is the colonialism, right? Colonialism ended 50, 60 years ago for most African countries, but with the exception of two, Liberia and Ethiopia, every country in Africa was under colonial rule. And it sounded as if the colonial period ended 50 or 60 years ago, but we all know that new forms of colonialism really exist. And these are not just theoretical. In very real terms, the connections with the former colonial countries. The control of the economy, the resources, the language they influence, on many factors. This is still very much alive, and it's part of what brings us within the struggle for African liberation, right? Mm-hmm. So this is just sort of a really quick overview on the past of the historical, and then that brings us into current day in terms of trends and what is the context of struggle for Africa. And the way I see it is there's sort of two parts of Africa, right? You've got the Northern Africa, which identifies mostly with the Middle East and sort of has a very, very different historical trajectory than Sub-Saharan Africa. It is all one continent, but it's very, very different in terms of how, including the colonial period and subsequent histories, have sort of played out with the Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa. Most of the work that we do within the U.S. sort of focuses mostly, without even consciously thinking about it, within Sub-Saharan Africa. Mm-hmm. And within Sub-Saharan Africa, I would say, well, continental. They're the one institution that looks at the continent wide in terms of economic, political, all aspects of the continent is the African Union. The African Union used to be the Organization of African Union, which then reformalized itself as the African Union about 10 years ago. And when it reorganized itself as the African Union, it came up with this incredible document that was highly hailed, the New Economic Partnership for African Development, or NEPAD. Some of you may remember this. It's highly hailed as a new era for African development. This is going to catapult Africa into the new world, into the new century. Basically, it was drafted in between Mbeki of Algeria and Obasanjo of Nigeria, in cohorts with the G8 to entrench, really kind of put the structure of economic, the neoliberal economic policies throughout the continent. So it's highly critiqued by African civil society. It hasn't really moved forward, and some of it, I have to say, there are some good aspects of it, but it completely overrode consultation with African civil society. This was entirely government-led and hasn't really sort of permeated into the broader. But still, African Union is the largest, most influential institution within Africa. And then you have the regional groups. You have SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community, right, which is led or dominated by South Africa. You have the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which is led or dominated by Nigeria. And then you have IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development for Eastern Africa, dominated by Ethiopia. I'm talking mostly of Sub-Saharan Africa because I think it would be, as I said at the beginning, quite different to do a comprehensive analysis of what are the Maghreb regions and the Sub-Saharan Africa. And with these regional bodies, the international community, the African Union, basically these are the groups that essentially determine the political, economic, major policies of the continent. I'll move now in terms of looking at trends, within Africa, what are some of the changes that have been happening. There's been a lot said about these new changes, the new trends that have sort of brought to light the voices of African civil society. The critique of the voices of major African civil society members has always been there. It just has not been able to be vocal and heard, outside of the context of Africa. There's always been a very strong critique of the governments, the nation states, the continental bodies of all, by non-governmental players, independent, the media, the African civil society leaders. I think we're hearing the voices now a lot more thanks to technology, thanks to the social forum processes that enable us to come into contact. So that's changing it a bit. In terms of what are the key trends, I had done this on the phone and I would narrow it to 4 regions, and I'm sure this could be expanded and discussed, all day, and you don't necessarily have to agree with me on this. But the 4 sections that I think are really key to understanding, one is democratization. And this is true both in terms of what we talked about recently in Tunisia and Egypt, but also in Cote d'Ivoire, what had happened in Cote d'Ivoire recently, which would have been unthinkable as recently as, let's say, 10 years ago. The person in power has absolute control, and this is true about many countries within the continent, totally dominates the political, economic sphere, has their people from family to ethnic groups that dominate the scene, and no one ever questions it. In the case of Cote d'Ivoire, when Gbagbo lost and refused to leave, you've seen all the attention in terms of forcing him to get out of office, and not just necessarily by the US and Europe, but also including by the African Union and the allies. So I think that's incredibly encouraging in terms of that and the compromises of the government of unity, which again could be an extended discussion. But what happened in Kenya with Kibaki and Raila actually forming a government, the person who lost in the election and the person who won fairly have to form a government of unity, which is an incredible experiment. Some say it's a great, new hope for Africa. Some say, it's opening up a whole new, confusing, complex, channel. And the same thing with Zimbabwe, right? So the process of democratization, which I think is incredibly encouraging, because we all know that when the colonial system or independence was declared, those who left put into office individuals and systems that work for them. So what we're seeing now is completely tied. Everything that we're seeing in Africa subsequent to colonialism has its roots under the colonial rule. The geographic division of countries, the ethnic divisions, the language, the culture, everything has everything to do with the colonial period. Any sort of conversations about slavery. People say, oh, that was what, 400 years ago, get over it, it was so yesterday. And it's so misleading to think that it's been 50, 60 years and therefore it should have been changed. It is still a reality today. It's permeated into every aspect of life within every part of Africa.
Before.
Yes, so that's the process of democratization that has started. The second one is that of militarization. We all know that within the history of how government changes have happened, economic forces, the military has been probably the strongest institutions anywhere in the continent. They're the most organized, they have the highest money, and they've got the guns, right? So what more do you need to say with a person who has got guns? But this has been largely within the continent. What we're seeing now is a globalized, militarized process that is threatening African sovereignty unlike any other time before. Because you've got the Africa Command Center, which was launched in October 2009. And what's alarming about this is that very few people even know about the African Command Center or what it means or the implications for the continent and for the world. Because you've got a system of militarized presence, United States militarized presence within Africa, throughout Africa, that is going to reshape the continent's, the continent's future. So I think that's something that we need to be mindful of and look at. I'm not even touching on European military presence, which is, I'm sure Colin can talk about this a lot in terms of the Frontex, the presence of Frontex, the border control, European border control agencies in the middle of Senegal. So that's entirely militarized, uniform-wearing people who, I mean, you really do begin to question what sovereignty means when you know, you've got
Yes.